Welcome to Quiet Scare, where horror doesn't scream, it whispers. A soft place for true shadows and real edges, where the volume stays low and the air does most of the talking. Tonight leans into real-feeling wilderness encounters, roadside strangeness, quiet workplace unease, old place rituals, and things that watch from tree lines and windows. Liking and subscribing really helps the channel, and tapping the bell keeps new episodes from slipping past. One more practical thing before the lights dim. There are a few ads in the first 10 to 15 minutes, then no mid-roll ads at all. Just rain and story without interruption. Something is out there, patient and close, moving where branches don't sway and radios forget their stations. Footsteps in the canopy instead of jump cuts. A shape that stands too still at the edge of the light. Voices that sound almost like language. The pace stays even, the edges stay soft, and the hush carries everything forward. Sleep well and dream dark. The campsite looked perfect in the fading daylight, a small clearing beside a creek that marked the border between two states. Jake had found it after hiking 2 miles off the main trail, following an old game path that wound through dense stands of oak and hickory. The spot was sheltered by tall trees on 3 sides, with the creek providing both water and the gentle sound of flowing water that would help mask any noise they might make. Jake dropped his pack and surveyed the area with the practiced eye of someone who had spent most of his adult life in the outdoors. Good drainage, close to water, and far enough from the trail that they would not have any unexpected visitors. His hunting partner Mike emerged from the tree line a few minutes later, breathing hard from the hike in. They had been friends since high school, had served together in the army, and had been making this annual hunting trip for the past 8 years. Mike was a city boy at heart, more comfortable with concrete and traffic lights than trees and wildlife, but he was game for adventure and could be counted on in a tight spot. Mike panted as he set down his own pack, questioning whether they needed to come this far out. Surely plenty of deer existed closer to the truck. Jake grinned and began unpacking his gear. The deer close to the truck had been shot at by every hunter with a license, he explained. Out here they were still wild, still smart. That was what made it interesting. They worked together to set up camp as the sun sank toward the horizon. Jake had brought a lightweight 2-man tent that they had used on previous trips, while Mike focused on gathering firewood and setting up their cooking area. The routine was familiar and comfortable, a ritual that marked the beginning of their escape from the civilized world. As darkness settled over the forest, they built a small fire and cooked a simple dinner of canned chili and cornbread. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, creating a circle of warm light that made the wilderness feel less vast and intimidating. They talked quietly about their plans for the morning, about the deer sign they had seen on the hike in, about anything except the jobs and responsibilities they had left behind. Mike suddenly held up a hand for silence, asking if Jake heard something. Jake listened carefully, sorting through the various sounds of the night forest. The usual suspects were present. An owl called in the distance. Small animals moved through the underbrush. Wind passed through the canopy. Underneath it all was something else, a low sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake identified it as coyotes after a moment. Probably a pack of them maybe a mile or 2 away just getting started for the night. Mike nodded, but Jake could see that his friend was still tense, still listening for something that might not belong. City life had made Mike jumpy about the sounds of the wilderness, though he would never admit it out loud. They banked the fire and retreated to their tent around 10 o'clock, both men tired from the long day of travel and hiking. The tent was cramped but warm, and Jake could hear Mike's breathing gradually slow as his friend drifted off to sleep. Jake lay awake a while longer, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the morning hunt. He was just beginning to doze when he heard it. The sound came from somewhere above them, perhaps 10 feet off the ground, and it was unlike anything Jake had heard in 20 years of hunting and camping. It started as a low moan that was almost human. It rose in pitch and volume until it became a shriek that seemed to cut the night open. Jake sat up so fast he nearly tore the rain fly. Beside him, Mike was already awake, his eyes wide in the dim light that filtered through the tent walls. Mike whispered urgently, asking what that was. Before Jake could answer, the sound came again, closer this time and definitely moving. It seemed to originate from the trail they had used to reach the campsite, but it was traveling parallel to the creek, following the border between the two states. The pitch and intensity varied. It dropped to a low growl. It rose to that bone-chilling shriek that made the hair on Jake's arms stand up. Jake reached for the pistol he kept in his sleeping bag. The weight of the weapon was reassuring, but he had no idea what he might be facing, or whether bullets would be effective. The sound moved past their campsite, traveling from east to west along the creek bank. Jake tracked its progress by the way it bounced off the trees, creating an echo effect that made it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. The unnerving part was the height. The sound came from well above ground level, as if something moved through the trees. Mike suggested it could be an owl, but his voice lacked conviction. Jake agreed it might be, though he did not believe it either. The sound was too loud and too directed. It felt intentional. The sound faded as it moved away, traveling west along the creek until it was a distant echo. They waited, listening to normal forest noise return, and neither spoke. Mike asked if Jake thought it was gone. Jake said he did not know, and that he was not going out there to check. They lay back down, but did not sleep. Every rustle seemed amplified. Jake strained for signs of its return. Mike lay rigid beside him, doing the same. 20 minutes later, it returned. This time it approached from the west, retracing its earlier path. It sounded more agitated. The shrieks were longer and more frequent. Branches snapped and leaves rustled as something large moved in the canopy. Mike whispered that it was coming back, and Jake heard the fear in his voice. The sound passed directly over their campsite. The tent seemed to tremble, as if something had brushed the guy lines or landed lightly on the rainfly. The shrieking filled everything. Then it stopped. The silence after was worse. They lay still and waited. The normal sounds returned gradually. Jake could not shake the sense that something watched them from above, patient and aware. Mike whispered that they should leave immediately. Jake considered it. Leaving in the dark with something moving above them felt worse. He decided to wait for daylight. The tent felt safer than stumbling through black woods. The sound returned twice more before dawn, following the same route along the creek. By the third pass, Jake noticed a pattern. The calls were not random. They rose and fell with a rhythm that suggested intent. For all the volume, there was no attack. Whatever moved above them had passed over multiple times without coming in close. Jake whispered that it was not hunting them. Mike asked what it wanted. Jake had no answer. The sound was a signal. That was the only word that fit. During the final pass, Jake caught a shape through the rainfly. The fly was translucent enough that starlight turned movement into shadow. He saw something long, moving with fluid grace. Limbs, longer than they should have been, a shape that did not fit any animal he knew. For a moment, it paused above their tent. Jake saw eyes catch faint light. They reflected like glass and seemed to focus. Then it moved on. Light seeped into the tent as morning came. The calls had ceased an hour before sunrise. Birds took up their chorus. The creek murmured as if nothing had changed. They broke camp quickly. In daylight, Jake studied the site for sign. He found nothing that he could prove. No tracks, no broken branches, close to the ground. Nothing but a few scuffed leaves, and the old path they had followed in. They hiked out fast and drove in silence for several miles. Mike asked what Jake thought it was. Jake offered the bird idea and did not sound convinced. Mike said it was not a bird. It was big and smart and wrong. Jake nodded. He had seen lions and bears. He had heard most voices the night woods could make. This was not one of those. In the weeks after, Jake read accounts from other backcountry travelers. They described loud, rising calls that came from above the ground and followed waterways at night. They had the same mix of fear and awe. Some called it a cryptid. Some said unknown bird or mammal. A few said something stranger. Jake returned to hunting, but not to that creek. Sometimes when the wind was still, he listened for that call and felt the tent fabric cool under his hand. He pictured the eyes above thin nylon and felt both small and strangely calm. At the spot where their tent had stood, a single twig lay balanced across the narrow path. When he visited months later in daylight, it was set at waist height between two saplings. He lifted it gently and set it aside, then walked on without a word. Marcus had driven this stretch of desert highway through the tribal lands countless times, but never this late. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:47 in the morning as he navigated the winding asphalt that cut through high desert country. He was returning from a camping trip with college friends near the ancient volcanic formation that rose like a cathedral from the mesa. The others had left that afternoon, but Marcus had stayed to watch the sunset paint the sandstone cliffs in shades of copper and gold. Now the landscape lay hidden beneath a moonless sky. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, lighting sagebrush and the occasional reflective eyes of jackrabbits that bounded across the road. The radio had lost signal 20 miles back. Only the tires and wind made sound. He thought about stories his friend David shared around the fire. David was from the local tribe, born and raised on the reservation, and he grew quiet when someone mentioned legends. "Some things you do not talk about," he had said, "especially not out here." Movement caught in the corner of Marcus's eye. A large coyote stood in the gravel shoulder, caught in the sweep of the headlights. It seemed bigger than any coyote he had seen. Its coat looked almost silver in the artificial light. Its eyes reflected with an intensity that made him slow. The coyote watched him pass. Marcus checked his mirror and saw it still standing, a dark shape against a sky full of stars. He pressed the accelerator. 5 minutes later, he saw it again. This time, the coyote ran alongside the road, keeping pace with the truck at 55. Marcus's pulse quickened. It moved with an effortless lope. The road curved and the lights brushed it. He pushed to 60, then 65. It kept pace. He gripped the wheel. Coyotes were fast, but not like this, and not for this long. He thought about a pack, or about depth and distance tricks in the dark. The highway dropped toward a wash. He lost sight of the animal and let his shoulders ease. The radio crackled with static. He reached to turn it off. When he looked back, the coyote stood in the center of the road. He braked hard. The truck slid to a stop 20 feet away. The animal did not move, and the harsh light details looked wrong. Legs too long, torso narrow, head too large. Ears sat in a way that looked familiar and not. The eyes were dark and aware. The creature began to change. It happened slowly at first. Limbs lengthened. Spine shifted upright. Fur thinned and slid away. The change looked like clay being reshaped. Within moments, a tall figure stood where the coyote had been. The figure was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its joints bent slightly off the way human joints bend. The skin had a faint sheen. The face held both human and coyote elements in a way that fit neither. Marcus froze. The figure tilted its head and studied him. Then it smiled. The teeth were small and crowded, more than he expected, set too close together. The spell broke. Marcus threw the truck into reverse and floored it. Gravel clattered. He cranked the wheel, got it spun around, and shoved the shifter into drive. In the lights, he saw the figure walking toward him with long steps. He drove hard, the speed climbing past 70, and then 80. He did not check the mirrors. He did not slow until the first town's lights filled the windshield. He pulled into an all-night truck stop and sat shaking until sunrise. He never told anyone about it. When David called to ask about the drive, Marcus said it was uneventful. He chose a longer route for future trips to avoid that road. In the weeks that followed, Marcus sometimes woke before dawn, with the sense that something watched from the window. He lay still and listened to the city sounds until the feeling faded. He did not open the curtains to check. The memory of those dark, aware eyes stayed with him. He thought about David's words by the fire. Some things you do not talk about. When he passed that stretch of highway months later on a bright afternoon with friends, the truck's radio cut to static for 2 seconds and came back clean. He did not mention it. He just watched the road. Todd had been hunting these mountain hills for 37 years, ever since his father first lifted him into the weathered oak stand overlooking the hollow. The same stand where he sat now, 20 feet above the forest floor, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to gray. November had settled deep into the mountains. His breath hung in the air, and every footstep cracked frozen leaves. He had chosen this morning carefully. Clear skies, no wind. Trail cam photos showed a large buck moving just after sunrise. Todd had studied the images until he could see every tine in his mind. The stand creaked as he shifted. A squirrel chattered to his left. A woodpecker worked dead timber in the distance. These were the sounds he knew. This morning felt different. The usual sound seemed muted, as if the forest held its breath. He checked his watch. 6:15. The sun would be up soon. The big deer would move along their routes. He had clear lanes in 3 directions and the wind in his favor. A twig snapped below. He turned slowly. A shape moved through the underbrush and paused in a small clearing, 40 yards away. It was not a deer. The creature stood upright near 7 feet, covered in long white hair that caught faint light. Its shoulders were broad. Its arms hung low. The face was not human and not animal. There was weight to the brow and strength in the jaw. Todd told himself it was a trick of light. Then it turned its head and looked up. He met its gaze through the scope. The eyes were dark and attentive. It began walking toward his tree. Each step was deliberate. The white hair shifted with movement. Up close it looked more like coarse fur. Todd's hand shook. He had faced bears and once a cat in these woods. Nothing felt like this. It stopped beneath his stand and looked up. They stared at each other. Its nostrils flared as it took in his scent. Curiosity showed on its face, and something like recognition, as if it understood the man in the tree was part of the pattern here. It turned and walked away. He watched it disappear and found tracks later. They were large. 5 toes showed clearly. The stride was long. He told no one. 3 days later he returned. Just after sunrise, the creature stood at the edge of the clearing and watched him from 60 yards. It did not approach. It turned and vanished into the trees. The 3rd time, a week later, his sister Sarah and her husband Tom were with him. They sat in a different stand. Sarah pointed toward the meadow and asked if that was a deer. Todd raised his binoculars. The white-furred creature stood just inside the trees by a large oak. Tom whispered a question that had no answer. The creature stepped out, revealed its height and bulk, then turned and slipped away. They sat stunned. Tom said they should call someone. Todd shook his head. No one would believe it. Sarah said they had all seen it. It was not a bear. In the weeks after, Todd returned but did not see it again. He heard distant sounds at night that might have been it calling to others, but he could not be sure. Winter came early. Todd put away his gear. In spring, he watched the woods without a rifle and understood something he had missed. This was not only an animal. It felt old. The white coat might be age. It had watched him as much as he had watched it. Todd never saw it again. On quiet mornings when mist lay low, he sometimes felt a gaze from the shadows. When he left apples by a stump for deer one autumn, he found the fruit gone, but the skins left in a neat pile. He smiled and said nothing. Brad had been hunting these woods for 37 years, long enough to know the difference between what belonged and what did not. The morning he lost his deer to something that should not exist started like any other November dawn, with frost silvering the pine needles and his breath forming small clouds in the still air. He had tracked the 8-point buck since before sunrise. following its trail through sweet gum and dogwood beneath towering loblolly pines. The shot was clean. The animal dropped at the edge of a small clearing, about 200 yards from the old logging road. He field dressed the deer quickly and tied bright tape to a branch to mark the spot. He went for the rope and tarp. When he returned 20 minutes later, the deer was gone. He assumed he got turned around. The pines could be disorienting. He searched until he found the tape. The clearing was empty. Blood stained the leaves where the deer had fallen. Drag marks led away. They were wide and deep, like something larger than a deer had been pulled. Brad followed the trail toward thicker pines where the canopy dimmed the morning. Claw marks gouged tree trunks higher than any man could reach. Sap still wept from fresh cuts. The pattern looked deliberate, not random territorial scratching. The woods had gone quiet. No birds, no wind. His heartbeat sounded loud. His hunting partner called his name from behind. The man had been a mile away. In still air, the sound carried. Brad called back. They met at the drag line. They followed the trail through massive trunks and patches of brush. The marks remained too wide and too deep. Brad considered black bears and dismissed them. His partner stopped suddenly and pointed up. The deer hung from a loblolly nearly 60 feet up. The body swayed lightly. The lowest branches on that tree started well above the ground. His partner whispered and asked how it got there. Brad stared. The base of the trunk showed deep gouges, spaced far apart, as if something climbed straight up. The cuts were sharp. The smell hit them, thick and musky. They stood for a long time. A breeze turned the carcass and showed the bullet hole. It was his deer. Something moved above the suspended body. Brad saw dark fur and heavy limbs in the canopy. It melted back into shade. His partner gripped Brad's arm and said they needed to leave. Brad agreed without looking away. They backed out of the pines and moved quickly to the trucks. The dragline felt like a path laid for them. The thought curdled in his gut. At the truck, his partner asked if he would hunt there again. Brad looked at the dark tops of the trees and said he did not know. He already knew he would not. That night he told his wife he missed the shot. It was easier to say. He read stories of game found in impossible places. He slept poorly. He checked locks and added lights. 3 weeks later, his partner drove back and called with an update. The deer was gone. The claw marks remained. New gouges appeared on other trees at the same height. Whatever used that grove still worked there. Brad hunted elsewhere. Sometimes passing the old logging road, he slowed and looked toward the pines. The canopy concealed everything. He pressed the accelerator and listened for a sound that had begun to haunt him. In quiet moments, he thought he heard claws rap softly on bark. Far away, a steady scrape like breath. Danny Whitaker had been born and raised in the hills of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains rolled toward the horizon and every hollow held old stories. He learned the language of the woods. He could tell a screech owl from a bobcat and could hear the difference between a startled deer and a distressed one. When Danny heard voices calling from the hollow that October night, he knew they did not belong to any creature he knew. The hollow got its name from a mining accident in 1952, when a shaft collapse killed 7 men who were never recovered. Families moved away. The forest grew back. Locals avoided the place because there was nothing there to visit. Danny tracked a wounded black bear into the area. A car had hit it on the highway. The wildlife department wanted the carcass found before it drew scavengers to the road. He followed the blood trail through oak and hickory. He passed rusting mining equipment under kudzu. The light was that particular late October light that makes leaves glow. He heard the first voice ahead of him. It was human in tone and wrong in meaning. The sounds had rhythm and cadence without words he knew. Another voice answered from a different direction. Then another. The hollow held a conversation in a language just beyond understanding. He stopped and listened. The voices were not coyotes or wildcats. They came from throats. The forest's evening chorus had fallen silent. The wind had stilled. The conversation stopped. The silence was complete. He heard his heart. He wanted to leave. He also wanted to know. He followed the blood trail, now moving more carefully. He passed into a grove of old hemlocks. The air under them was cool and still. He found the bear at the base of a large tree. It had been dead for hours. The body had been moved, not by scavengers. It lay on its back with legs arranged symmetrically. Its head faced the canopy. The ground around it had been cleared in a rough circle. Symbols were scratched in the dirt. The lines looked too regular to be chance. He took photos. The voices started again, closer now on the ridge above the grove. The sound grew rhythmic. It became a chant. The syllables nearly formed patterns he felt but could not parse. Something large moved in the trees above him. Branches creaked. Leaves rustled. Shadows passed. He could not see forms clearly. He felt watched from several points. The chant reached a peak and stopped. The movement in the canopy shifted away. The sounds receded. The woods returned to ordinary evening. Danny waited a few minutes. He finished his photographs and hiked out. The walk took forever. Every shadow held possibility. No voices returned. He reached his truck at last light. At home, he studied the images. The arrangement did not look like random disturbance. The symbols were too regular. He had heard stories all his life. He knew the Cherokee once lived in these hills. He knew what elders said about places where things were thin. He had dismissed most of it as story. But the grove shifted something in him. He returned to the hollow in the weeks that followed. He did not hear the voices again. He found more markings. He saw stones placed in patterns. He saw bark peeled in lines. He read about the area's past. The hollow had been considered sacred. Mining had covered older sites and cut through places used for ceremony. The more he learned, the more the hemlock grove made sense to him. The voices were not speaking a modern tongue. They might be echoing something older. He did not report any of it. He visited respectfully and finished his wildlife work. When others later told their own stories about the hollow, he listened and nodded. On some evenings when the wind held still, Danny heard a faint carrying of sound down the ridge. It was not words. It was the rise and fall of speech. He stood and listened until it faded, then walked home quietly. The creek had taken everything. Daniel stood at the edge of what used to be his backyard, staring at the muddy scar that wound through the valley. 3 months had passed since the flood, but the land still looked broken. The garden was gone. The workshop was gone. Only concrete and twisted scrap remained. The creek that now slid by was narrow and shallow in the evening light. It had been a roaring channel when it rose. It had carried away houses and cars without care. Daniel had lost his home and business to that water. The insurance company fought him. The trailer was a box with thin walls. The contractors were unreliable. Some days he thought the water should have taken him too. This felt like one of those days. He had spent 14 hours hauling debris. Albums were pulp. Furniture was warped. Tools were rusted. Each piece was a small death. The full moon made the creek look pretty. That made him angry. He picked up a rock and threw it into the water. He threw another and cursed. A voice answered from the stream. He froze and looked around. The valley was empty. The voice came again and told him to stop. He asked who was there. There was only the creek sound. He reached for another rock. The voice returned, more insistent. It came from the water. It sounded real. He answered as if he spoke to another person. He asked who she was. She said she lived in the water. He asked to see her. The sound that followed could have been laughter, and could have been current. She told him to look where the water ran dark. He looked into a deep pool. The surface reflected the sky. As he watched, a face formed. It was a young woman's face with long dark hair that moved with the stream. Her eyes were the color of deep water. She smiled. He stepped back. The face giggled like spring bubbles. She offered to tell him a story. Daniel sat on a rock and watched the pool. Her voice came from the water and the air. She said she had many names, none of them truly hers. People called her the woman in the riffles. Some called her she at the bend. She had lived in this creek longer than his people had lived in these hills. She said she had once been flesh and blood. She lived in a village on this stream when the first families hunted and farmed here. Winter had been hard, game was scarce, children were hungry. The elders held a ceremony at the deep bend. They asked for mercy and life. She walked into the water and did not turn back. She felt her body slip away and her spirit remain with the current. Daniel asked if the tribe survived. She said the spring came and the rains returned. People lived. New people came. Old houses fell, and new mills rose. She stayed with the water. Daniel asked why she had flooded them. She said she did not call the storm. She felt his grief in every drop that carried his life away. She carried it too. He said nothing helped. She told him he was not gone. He could build again. The water that took could also give. He looked at the valley. The damage remained. New green pushed up in places. Birds sang in the willows. He asked if he would see her again. She said she was always here. He should listen. He sat until dawn while she told old stories of this bend, families planting, fishermen pulling traps, a child dropping a ring and laughing when it flashed in the shallows. He felt anger ease while she spoke. As the sun rose, her face faded. He picked up one last rock and did not throw it. He set it on the bank where it would not wash. Then he walked back to the trailer and began a list. At night, he sometimes heard the creek speaking in small sounds against stones. On hard mornings, he would go to the pool and look into the dark water. He did not always see a face. He always felt watched with a kind of care that did not belong to people. The restaurant on Market Street stayed busy until 10 most nights. By 11:30, the rush had faded to late workers and students. Sarah wiped down the prep counter and checked the rice warmers. 3 weeks of night shifts had left her wired at midnight and exhausted by dawn. Through the front windows, pedestrians moved along the sidewalk under amber lights. This part of downtown grew quiet after the bars closed. Sarah liked the way sound softened after midnight. She was refilling salsa when movement outside caught her eye. A tall woman walked past the window with a measured stride. The woman wore a pale green dress that looked expensive. Her hair was shoulder length and straight. It caught the streetlight in a strange way. The bell chimed. The woman entered. Up close, she looked even more striking. She stood at least 6 feet tall. She had a sculptural face and a steady gaze. Sarah greeted her and moved to the counter. The woman studied the menu boards. When she looked directly at Sarah, the lights seemed to flicker. Sarah could not tell if it was real. The woman asked for a bowl with rice and chicken. Sarah scooped rice. The woman's head tilted slightly as if she weighed each question. A low hum filled the space. It was barely audible at first. Sarah glanced around. Miguel washed dishes in the back. No one else was in the room. The hum grew louder. A tingling crawled along Sarah's arms and neck. The woman's eyes darkened until the pupils seemed to swallow the irises. The woman's face began to change. The skin texture shifted. Underlying bones seemed to move. The skin took on a smooth, glossy look like polished stone. The jaw extended in a way that was not human. Sarah tried to step back. Her muscles did not respond. The sound swelled and pressed inside her head. It felt like fingers sorting memory. The eyes were the worst. They turned completely dark and seemed to be windows without a back. The woman smiled. The teeth looked triangular and too many, like a predatory fish. Pain cut through Sarah's skull. Something forced contact inside her mind. It was not gentle. Thoughts tore. She felt an old self become thin. Images poured in. Vast rooms made of forms that hurt to see. Beings that moved along directions she did not know how to name. Distance and size that erased people. The presence felt amused and remote. It examined and dismissed her. It planted something in her mind. The contact broke. Sarah collapsed behind the counter. The woman's face returned. The hum faded. The light steadied. The woman asked for sour cream. Sarah's hand shook. She added sour cream. Blood ran from her nose. She finished the bowl in a daze and fought the urge to scream. The woman paid with exact change and took a seat. She ate with normal movements. She cleaned her table and left. Miguel came out and asked if she was okay. He said she looked pale and had blood on her face. She said she felt sick and left early. On the walk home, she scanned the shadows. She did not see the tall figure again. She did not need to. It was with her now. In the weeks that followed, Sarah felt changed. The thing it planted grew. She felt detached from routine. The mirror showed a face that looked like hers, and not makeup and effort hid what others did not seem to see. She fought urges she did not recognize. She stood in empty lots and listened to voices that did not carry through air. She learned to notice people who would hear more clearly than others. The night shift continued. Sarah worked with something else inside her. She began to understand there was a plan that moved slowly. It did not need anyone to notice it to succeed. Sometimes when the restaurant was empty and the street was quiet, she looked at her reflection in the dark window. For a second, the glass returned a face that was not entirely human. She turned away and finished the prep list. Tom Brennan had seen his share of bears in 23 years of hunting wilderness areas. He had tracked brown bears in remote peninsulas and watched grizzlies take salmon from bright water. Bears were part of the North, like long summer light and winter aurora. When Tom moved to eastern Kentucky for a forestry service job, he figured the dangerous wildlife was behind him. Kentucky had black bears, but they were smaller and avoided people. Its hardwood ridges and clear streams felt tamer than the North. That changed on a cold December morning in his third year in Kentucky. He sat in a tree's stand on a ridge above a small valley with a spring-fed creek. The stand was 15 feet up a massive oak. He had a clear view of trails. He had killed deer here before. It was quiet. He was thinking about climbing down when something moved below. The sound was heavier than deer. It pushed through brush without concern. He readied his bow and watched the edge of the clearing. What stepped out was neither bear nor hog. The creature stood upright, close to 7 feet, covered in dark hair streaked with pale patches. It was massive across the shoulders. Its arms hung low. The hands ended in thick, dark nails. The head sat on a neck so thick it merged with the shoulders. Tom's first thought was costume. Then he watched it move. The gait was powerful and balanced in a way no person could fake. It lowered its head to drink. Muscles shifted under the hair. The air carried a strong animal scent that was not like bear. It smelled like wet fur and something older. It straightened and scanned the valley. Its head turned slowly. Tom held still. He felt the gaze sweep his tree. It looked up at him. They locked eyes. The eyes were dark and assessing. The stare felt like a decision being made. After seconds that felt longer, it turned and walked away in silence. Tom stayed in the stand for an hour. When he climbed down, he found tracks by the creek. They were large and human-like in shape. 5 toes showed. The depth and spacing suggested weight and a long stride. He took photos and measured the prints against his boot in the frame for scale, without stating his boot size. He returned in the weeks after and saw the creature twice more, both at a distance. The second time he realized it followed the route he had taken in. It was learning him. The third time, he stood in a clearing 50 yards from it with only a knife on his belt. It watched him and raised one hand. The fingers were too long. He felt his thoughts slide into a place he did not like. The lips pulled back in a smile that showed serrated cusps that did not belong on an ape. It turned and slipped into the trees. He told his sister and her husband in spring and took them to the valley. An hour into the hike, his brother-in-law pointed toward pines on the far side of the creek. The creature stood among the trees. It watched them. It was not the white furred figure that others had described in these hills. This one's hair was darker with pale streaks, tangled with bits of pine and leaf. It held itself differently. It was still impatient. They watched it. It turned and vanished. They returned several times and never saw it again. Tom found occasional tracks near the creek, and one blurred image on a trail camera that might have been it. Signs appeared near his house months later, footprints at the edge of the tree line, motion lights triggered with nothing visible under the beams. In the woods, he felt watched. He caught glimpses of dark hair slipping through brush, just at the edge of vision. He did not report it. He kept the secret and spoke about it only with people who had their own stories. Years later, he moved north again. The bears there seemed ordinary. On some winter nights, he woke with the sense of a presence outside the cabin. He lay still and listened until it passed. He did not check the window. In the morning, he sometimes found one oval patch of melted frost on the porch that looked like a bare place where something warm had stood and waited. The alarm clock read 3:15 when I shut it off, 2 minutes before it would have sounded. September mornings in the Pacific Northwest held a stillness that made you hear your own breath. I dressed in the dark and loaded the truck. The conference was in a mountain town. The ferry began its run at 6. Outside, the air was glassy. Gravel crunched. The woods behind the house rose in a wall of Douglas fir and cedar. I had lived on this land long enough to feel its rhythm. I lifted the tailgate and set my case in the bed. 50 yards of open grass stretched to the trees. 100 yards of dense forest dropped toward the bay. The sound came. It started low, then climbed and held. It lasted 5 or 6 seconds. It flowed like a voice. It stopped for a few beats and then repeated at exactly the same pitch and length. Dogs in every direction began barking. The chorus rolled across the neighborhood. One deep bay, several sharp yips, a few long howls from dogs I had never heard before. The sound of the morning changed. I stood with my laptop case in my hands and listened. The cry came from directly behind the house, close enough to reach in 2 minutes, close enough that whatever made it could see me. My first thought was clear. It was a primate. My second thought followed. There were no primates in those woods. I set the case down and walked back to the porch. The light cast a small circle. I turned it off. The dogs quieted one by one. Silence returned. I stood on the steps and waited. 15 minutes passed. The woods remained still. I finished loading and drove to the airport. The sound rode with me as a memory. I gave the presentation and came home a week later. The clearing felt like a different room in the same house. I listened differently. Small creaks carried weight. Branches that fell in the night made me stop and count heartbeats. On a clear October morning, I returned from the marsh with 2 roosters. I cleaned birds on a pine log 20 feet from the road. The septic tank lay somewhere under the grass nearby. Fee the dog lay by my feet and chewed a wing. I had just reached for the second bird when a fir 20 feet ahead began to sway. There was no wind. The other trees stood still. This trunk whipped side to side. Small limbs snapped and fell. Larger branches cracked and struck the ground. I stood with the knife in my hand and watched. The dog froze and then backed toward the house without a sound. He moved carefully and kept his eyes on the trees. The swaying ceased. 10 seconds passed. The sound of wood breaking resumed. It came as a series of sharp cracks, as if branches snapped across a knee. I gathered the birds and followed the dog to the steps. The knife felt like no help. By the time we reached the porch, the woods were quiet again. The broken branches lay in the grass. I felt watched, as if a line had been drawn. I cleaned the birds in the kitchen sink. That evening I called a colleague who had spent time with elders. I told him about the morning cry and the thrashing tree. He listened, and then said the old people had stories. They did not question whether such things existed. They learned to live alongside them. He said whatever it was it wanted me to know. He said backing away was wise. In the weeks that followed, I paid attention. Some places in the woods felt like rooms where someone else stood just out of view. New branches lay across a trail where none had been the day before. Low shrubs were bent and woven like a sign at knee height. I began to understand that I lived at the edge of two ways of knowing. The scientist in me wanted evidence. The person who had heard that voice knew evidence might not come on command. I stopped cleaning birds at the log by the trees. I did that work closer to the house. The morning I moved away, I stood at the clearing and looked toward the woods. The trees were dark silhouettes. I lifted my last box into the truck. A single knock sounded from the ravine. It echoed once from farther off and then went still. I closed the tailgate and drove to the ferry in the first light. Dr. Sarah Chen had built her career on evidence. 15 years of work had earned her tenure. Her walls held journals. Her computer held datasets and analysis. Her reputation rested on what could be replicated. When graduate student Todd brought cryptid encounter reports for his folklore thesis, Sarah read them as cultural material. They were useful for studying belief and story. Then she read the report from retired forest ranger William Hayes. It was different. It read like a professional incident report, with coordinates, weather, timestamps, and careful descriptions. Hayes wrote about tracking what he thought was an injured hiker and finding a bipedal creature in a clearing. He documented the encounter without dramatics. He included alternative explanations and his reasons for rejecting them. Marcus told her Hayes had died 3 years ago. He had found Hayes' supervisor, Janet Morrison. She said Hayes was the most reliable ranger she supervised. If he wrote it, he saw it. Sarah thought about the report for weeks. She had always worked from a materialist view. The report asked her to widen the frame. She read about traditional worldviews and how many cultures understand reality to include things science cannot yet measure. She asked if her framework had been too narrow. The question became personal in an old farmhouse in Appalachia, when she interviewed 87-year-old Edith Caldwell. They had talked about family history and old remedies. When Sarah asked about legends, Edith grew quiet and looked toward the trees. She said she had seen a wood booger. She had seen it many times in the same section of forest. Edith described a massive figure that watched. She first saw it when she was 12. It tilted its head. It smiled in a way that made her want to be sick. It returned over the decades. It never came close to the house. It watched from the edge of the trees. Sarah asked what Edith thought it was. Edith said some things had always lived here. People did not have to accept them for them to exist. On Sarah's last visit, Edith looked past her and went rigid. Sarah turned and saw a shape at the tree line. It stepped out. It stood near 8 feet tall and was covered in dark hair. Its face was almost human and wrong. Its eyes caught the last light. When it smiled, the teeth showed crowded and sharp. It raised a hand. The fingers were long. The steps toward the house shook floorboards. Pressure built behind Sarah's eyes as if something were testing a boundary. Edith pulled her to the back. They went down into the basement. The air smelled like earth. Above them, slow, heavy steps circled the house. Something breathed close to a window. 20 minutes passed before the sounds faded. They waited. When they came up, prints marked the earth, and claw marks scored window frames. Sarah drove back to her hotel shaking. The encounter had not asked for her belief. It had moved through her life without it. She incorporated the question into her classes. She did not tell the story. She asked if the scientific method was the only way to know a thing, and whether some phenomena sit where consciousness and culture blur measurement. Her paper on the subject drew praise and criticism. She was comfortable with both. She had learned that belief is shaped by experience as much as by data. Late at night, when the trees outside her windows shifted in the wind, Sarah sometimes saw the shape of a face where darkness was thickest. On those nights, she closed her laptop and turned off her desk lamp. She sat and listened to the house settle. She let the question hang in the room and did not try to answer it.